Hello and welcome. I'm Jared Anderson. I work at Kidder Matthews in Seattle, and we sell apartment buildings. I'm hosting McKenzie Darr, who works at Grand Peak Properties, and they specialize in development in the Northwest and West Coast.
Grand Peak is headquartered in Denver,
Okay.
and we do development and acquisitions throughout the United States. We have a big presence in Denver, Florida, and then up here in the Pacific Northwest as well.
Okay. So today we're here to talk about rent control. McKenzie's been very involved as the bill became a law, as we'll call it, and we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty of how it affects owners, how it affects the cities and states in Washington, and how it affects developers as well. So diving right in, what was your involvement with this bill? I heard multiple people saying that you're very well versed on what was going on.
Good. I'm glad my reputation precedes me and that it's a positive one. I have been involved with NAIOP, Washington State's government affairs program, the last several years, and so rent control was proposed and defeated the past two legislative sessions before this one, and I was heavily involved in that effort and have stayed engaged. I'm also on the board of Partnership for Affordable Housing, which is an organization focused on research on rent control and how it would impact and will impact Washington State from a supply, property tax perspective. And then also on the board of Build Up Washington, which is an advocacy organization that was opposed to rent control.
Gotcha.
A couple different
So
ways.
you've been involved in different ways. And then I was aware of the last few years, legislative sessions, it's proposed, it's a potential threat to owners, and here we are. So what transpired from it being proposed initially, being defeated, to proposed and now approved?
I think one of the big changes with our legislative branch is that generally we saw over the last election cycle, from a federal perspective, the entire country moved a little bit more conservative, obviously, with the presidential elections, and there was backlash amongst our state, and our state moved more progressive. So relative to our House and Senate in prior years, we did have a more Democratic-heavy House and Senate, which made it easier for them to get the votes to move this through. And there certainly was a lot of involved conversations, and where it started and where it ended up, there were improvements made in the bill, but that's why it was really able to be passed this year, when in prior years it wasn't. It's just a change in the electorate that we have here.
And the narrative around, let's call it rent control in Washington State, the reason it hasn't existed is some sort of ban or opposition, something that was passed many, many years ago. Is that still in effect, or what happened with that?
Yes, so there is state preemption against rent control, which means that local cities, Seattle included, cannot adopt their own forms of rent control or any way cap your rent.
And that's still in existence?
That's still in existence. This bill did not change that.
Okay.
But there's not state preemption against other items within the Residential Tenant Landlord Act. So in theory, cities have exercised their control to cap late fees, require advance notice, cap security deposits. Cities are still empowered to do all of that, so they can implement regulations that affect your operations, but they cannot adopt a different cap on rent.
Okay. Could they call it something else, or is the preemption at a state level from counties and cities from applying more rent control pretty ironclad?
I think it's pretty clear. It certainly could be modified in the future. It is just part of the RCW, so any bill that's passed generally modifies the RCW.
What does RCW stand for?
The Revised Code of Washington.
Okay, great. So we've now passed statewide rent control. There's tons of information out about this, about the different levers that have been pushed and pulled. So we don't need to go in super detail there. Is there anything that's just not obvious on the surface in this bill? Like, I know we've got, was it 7% plus CPI or 10%, whichever is less, is the cap annually. There's some rules on how much time you need to provide notice within, caps on, is it late fees, other things?
Most of the operational pieces were removed from the bill as it relates to security deposit and late fee caps.
Okay.
I believe. But I think the big thing that some people might not know is this provision that requires parity across lease types. And so what that means is for an individual unit, you cannot charge more than 5% difference in what you're renting that unit for, whether it's on a 12-month basis or a month-to-month basis or 3-month basis.
Oh, so it's on the term of the lease.
Right.
So I couldn't say, hey, this one bedroom is available for a 12-month lease at $2,000 or $3,000 month to month.
Yes, and I think that how a lot of owners are responding is just not offering those shorter terms.
But as far as what you said that concerned me was like, oh, if I have a 1-bedroom and a like-kind unit, different leases, and they're off by more than 5%, I'm in trouble, but that's not.
No,
okay.
It's for a specific unit.
Okay, that makes sense. So different lease terms, capped at 5% premium, let's call it.
Right. So if you have a 1-bedroom that's 500 square feet with a balcony on the top floor, you can still charge more for that unit than a 1-bedroom, same square footage that doesn't have those features. Or even a different unit that has those features. But for that specific unit, you can't charge more for a 3-month lease than a 12-month lease if that delta is more than 5%.
Gotcha. Okay. How does the rent controls, if anything, affect other income? So parking, utilities, pet fees, sort of things.
Yeah, it's a great question because I personally don't think it's completely clear in the bill. So the way that the bill was written, rent is capped. You cannot increase rent over the first 12 months, and then you cannot increase rent by more than that cap over any 12-month period.
Okay.
It's just rent in that section of the bill, but in the notice of increase provision in the bill, you have to provide notice of rent increase on a form substantially similar to what's outlined in the bill, and that does say rent and fees. So I think there's room for interpretation and how different owners and operators are interpreting that provision, and eventually, how that plays out potentially in the courts, depending on what happens, I think is yet to be seen. I think it could be interpreted either way. I think that the portion where it references fees that are pertinent to occupancy in the unit. So something that's like an optional additional fee, like potentially pet fee or parking, I don't think would fall in this potentially limited, but utilities, I think, could fall in this area of gray where it's potentially limited.
So if you, and this is very common with a lot of the private owners I work with, if you were not charging for utilities and wanted to start charging a fair market amount, if that amount exceeded that 7% plus CPI of their rent or 10%, whichever is lower, they potentially be at risk for exceeding that rent control, but it's not clear.
I think it's not clear. I'd advise talking to an attorney that knows more than me.
Well,
but
not
I
a lot
think
more
there's
in 5 years.
Yes. Yeah. When somebody else has seen these things play out.
Yeah, okay. But regarding the parking, I just toured a building on Monday, and they've never charged for parking. Each unit actually has a great parking stall right outside of it, not great street parking on the street, and I think that's a prime opportunity for the owner to capture some more income. So that possibly, not including the rent, if they added on some parking rent, it wouldn't affect their rent control as the bill's laid out right now.
My interpretation is that it would not affect it because that's not required to occupy the unit.
Great. Okay, that's helpful to know. What else, and we'll get into development, I know it's its own full spectrum, but what else for existing buildings, owners, residents that we have that isn't super obvious?
I think the interplay with MFTE will be interesting to watch how that unfolds. The exemption for new construction is 12 years. But if you have a building that is participating in MFTE, you naturally are going to have some leases that are turning in your 12th year of the exemption that might run into your 13th year of operations because you're not signing all your affordable leases the day your building opens. And because of that, there may be a subset of units within any given property that in year 13, you're no longer getting that tax exemption, but those units are protected by rent control and they're at below market rents.
Oh, so you might not be able to capture full market rent the day you roll off.
Right. It would take you longer.
The tax abatement. And just to clarify, what is MFTE?
The multifamily tax exemption.
And just quick highlight on that program.
The multifamily tax exemption program is a program that allows for a property tax exemption on the value of the residential improvements for a period of 8, 12, 20 years, depending on what program it is specifically. And generally, it requires affordable housing in exchange for that tax exemption. So
if I have a 100-unit building, I may get exempt property tax for the residential improvements.
So the land still taxed, any commercial value still taxed.
So I got 12 years of abatement from tax on my residential improvements, and in exchange I give 20% of my units to the program, and they
Generally
meet
20%.
some affordability requirement.
Yes,
Okay.
which the state, for the 12-year program specifically, the state requires that at least 20% of the units be affordable at least at 80% of area median income.
Mm-hmm.
And cities can modify that. So many cities, like Seattle, have lower affordability requirements, but some just maintain the state requirements.
Okay. So the risk being you've built a building, it's now year 11 and a half, 12, and you've got these significantly below market rents because you're rolling off the protection from the rent control and off the exemption. You might be double jeopardy. Is that used correctly?
I don't know if that would be the correct term, but
You might get hit from both sides, right?
Right.
You're paying now
Right.
full property tax, and you have an an affordable unit that's been affordable for the program, but you lose that exemption of them.
right,
tax.
exactly. And that tenant that's in place, assuming that their lease expires and you're willing to renew them, that tenant is still capped at the rent cap. And so even if they're well below market because it's a unit that had to be affordable at 60% of area median income, you can't take that unit directly to market rate unless that tenant vacates.
Okay.
And the risk there too is if you're looking at acquiring a property that's in year 10,
Yeah.
you just need to forecast that it may take you longer to bring those units back to market rate rents.
Okay. So sticking with the existing stock of buildings, not going full development yet, most commonly, my clients who own 20 to 100 unit buildings in Seattle, most of them are built in the 2000 or older, so they're not exempt from anything. And most of them are providing what I believe is market rate affordable housing, right? They've operated these well, they bought them right, they might not have any debt, and therefore they're offering a more affordable unit than anyone else in the market. And they're doing well, and the tenant's doing well. When they go to sell, our typical as brokers story is, right, this building needs some love, needs
Right,
some
right.
money spent on it, and to justify doing so, you'll be rewarded with increasing rents, improve the product, and improve the rents. And now it sounds like that's gotten a lot more difficult. So
Yes.
a few clients have already asked, like, is there any program for relocation? And one of them said that TREO, so a city level program, tenant relocation assistance ordinance, is still in effect. So you can still apply for that permit, help rehome these people, put the money in the property, and then achieve fair market rents. Is that correct, or is that in your...
That is my understanding.
Okay.
So again, it's possible to do this. It just is potentially more costly than
Okay.
it might have been prior to this legislation going into effect, when the owner had more options for how they made units available for these improvements.
Okay, makes sense. Anything else on the existing buildings you think is important?
I think one of the challenges people should be aware of is that there was discussion about creating some sort of capital improvements pass-through. So if you put a new roof on your building, how can you allow tenants to absorb some of that cost above and beyond the rent cap? And it didn't really get a lot of traction this year in Olympia. I think it's something that as an industry we'll continue to explore, particularly because we don't want to see buildings go into disrepair. We want owners to maintain their buildings, but it is harder with these rent caps when operational expenses are not also similarly capped.
Yeah, I mean, we looked at just data, and I'll call it anecdata because we don't have enough of a set, but internally, how much have expenses grown on properties, and we were underwrite 100 to 200 properties each year when we did them in 2020 and now. So about 5 years, expenses have grown around 50%.
Right.
Income or rent has grown 18%.
Right.
So is there any way to, you'd already mentioned it, but is there no way for owners to counteract that? And the biggest expenses are taxes, which are in the government's control, who's imposed this, and then insurance, which is, you could argue, who's in control of that, but those are the two, and then utilities. So the uncontrollables have really gotten out of hand.
I think the interesting thing is that instead of having a conversation about, like, do we cap property taxes like California has with a Prop 13, the conversation in Olympia was, well, we're in a budget deficit and we need more, so do we lift the property tax levy lid? And it was really challenging as an owner looking at these two bills advancing, and luckily that property tax bill did not advance and it did die. But looking at these two bills advancing and saying, how could we as owners make sense of new developments when our taxes may raise even more quickly than they have in the past?
Yeah.
And I think it's a risk that is a little unique to Washington State, frankly, as part of the rent control conversation. California, you do have a little bit more protection with Prop 13. And then even in Oregon, there's different set of taxes that comprise their tax base. So there's income tax that they could draw from or consider increasing. Whereas in Washington State, there's a little bit more pressure on property taxes and on real estate related taxes as well, like the real estate excise tax. So that risk is just outstanding, and I don't think there's any clear protection for it, nor do I think that there will be a lot of traction in Olympia for creating a property tax lid for multifamily property that provides some offsetting protection.
So it's transitioning now. We're kind of getting to new development, right? You got to forecast if you're going to take the risk of developing property, which is a huge risk, usually 5 to 6 year process. People don't realize it takes that long from inception to lease up. We're thinking about rent control. We're thinking about expense uncontrol. What other risks are there, and do you think people will keep developing?
I think people will keep developing as long as our market fundamentals remain really strong and we continue to experience a housing shortage like we are right now. And right now we're in a period where supply has outpaced demand, but I think we're moving towards a more stabilized market and it will create opportunities. But I think it changes the capital players that are really interested in this market. I think a subset of investors are saying, I could get the same return in Arizona, Florida, Texas, places that don't have the same operational risk. But there are investors that work in other markets that have rent control, like worked in New York or California, and they see that there's opportunity here. We have high incomes, we have population growth, we have a big delta between ownership cost and rental cost, and we have limited land. So there is opportunity, but I think the people that want to capitalize on that opportunity are potentially a little bit more cautious, a little bit more aware, a little bit more politically engaged than they've been in the past. One of the risks with rent control is what I would call the slippery slope argument. So with rent control, I think this bill is generally workable in the sense that it might be the straw that breaks the camel's back for some investors, but it's likely not the sole reason why an investor on the development side specifically is leaving the market. I think that becomes a little bit more complicated on value add, and on value add it may be the sole reason. But it's one of a plethora of policies that have made it more challenging to do work here over the last several years, like the real estate excise tax increase in 2019, like inclusionary housing policies that have challenged economics of some deals. So you need investors that have more conviction in this market and really believe in those fundamentals, being able to overcome these operational hurdles, these economic hurdles that are unique to our state and our market.
And you work at a development company. How has your company looked at this change and others like yours?
Yeah, our company is headquartered in Denver, as I mentioned, and our office in Seattle is a small satellite office. So our leadership actually recently made the choice to close our Pacific Northwest office, and the top reason cited by our CEO was regulatory risk. And we're not the only developer that has made that decision in recent years. Wood Partners was one that was a really high-profile exit of this market. And also, I think you're seeing with some rates, if you just look at transaction data, EQR certainly has been a net seller in the past several years, and that might be just a choice based on market cycle. But if you look at what's being passed, it's understandable that this might not be their highest growth market. But I think that those exits create opportunity for the sponsors that stay in the market and hopefully make your life a little easier as a broker when the people who are here have more strength in this market. They've made sense of the legislation and they're more committed here. So the buyers that come through hopefully are real buyers that know what they're getting into.
Interesting. We speak with a lot of developers, constant conversation, build to hold, build to sell. Do you think this bill, if you're going to develop in Seattle, motivates you more to hold long term or sell quickly after stabilization?
You know, it's a good question, and I'm not sure the impact per se, because even if you're a developer and you're a merchant builder and you're going to sell as soon as you're stabilized, or if you're lucky even sooner, you still have to sell to a buyer that's going to have to deal with the consequences of this policy. So I think that regardless of what your intention is and your business model is, somebody has to contend with the effects of this, so you're not isolated from it even if you're a merchant builder.
So I guess taking it downstream, do you think the buyers in this market of new or old product are going to hold longer term or shorter term? Because I was speaking with a client that does syndication, so raises money and buys, and they said they have to expand their horizon for their investment hold. because it's going to take longer to make the improvements, and who knows how the bill's going to ripple through, the worldview of investing in Seattle. So.
Yeah, I would certainly see that being true. It'll take longer to make your improvements. It'll also take longer to realize the rent increases that you could from common area improvements, structural improvements, anything that is maybe not requiring an in-place tenant to leave, but would, give you the opportunity to potentially place a hefty premium. Mm-hmm. It'll take longer to capture those gains. At the same time, we're a market with high frictional costs of the real estate excise tax. So if it's taking you longer to realize gains, you're still being tax heavy on the exit, it makes sense that you might want to cash flow that longer, get more revenue before you're incurring additional costs.
I know a common concern with rent controls is that expenses rise faster than income does, which has happened in the state. Mm-hmm. And now it's being capped, the income, what its growth potential is. And it removes the incentive to improve the properties. Was that talked about at a state level, and what was their, takeaway?
It was discussed. I think as an industry, we pushed pretty hard for a capital improvements pass-through. It was included in a version of the bill about 2 years ago, so it's something that got traction once. But I think the general sentiment amongst lawmakers who aren't in the weeds on these deals and they don't understand what owners are facing from an operational cost increase perspective. Yeah. Generally, the conversation in Olympia was, well, if you can increase rent by 7%, 10%, why isn't that enough? Mm-hmm. And I don't think there's real recognition of how significant these cost increases are, because there's a perception that the profit margin is so big that you as an owner could forego a little bit of profit and it'll all be fine.
Yeah. And if that was the case, we'd have a lot more sales in the last few years. The returns on apartment properties in Seattle, where I focus, are razor thin at best. They're most likely, buyers right now are planning to lose money for a couple of years, just because of how interest rates weigh into the cost of the purchase and then the operation of it.
Yeah, and I think we're seeing the challenges in financing deals. If you just look at construction permit issuance data and permit application data, some cities are contemplating layoffs for their permit review, plan review, entitlement staff, land use staff. So you're certainly seeing that it's not all that profitable. Otherwise, everyone would be in this industry and everyone would be having transactions, and the cities wouldn't have conversations about how down real estate excise tax collections have impacted their budgets. Yeah. So even though there's all this data showing that it's not actually that appealing to be in this industry unless you can really find that diamond in the rough right now, I don't think there's that recognition in Olympia. But where I think we are starting to see a little bit more of that recognition is within certain cities. So Seattle, for example, recently passed legislation that allows for more flexible ground floor uses in mixed-use buildings, and I think they're recognizing that it may be hard for you to get a retail tenant in, and it's not doing what they want for the streetscape to have vacant retail spaces. Yeah. But it's also a concession, I think, to the industry, and they've looked at a number of other changes. The mayor recently published a letter saying that they want to convene a work group for the mandatory housing affordability requirements so that they're not inadvertently discouraging new supply, particularly new supply of townhomes in smaller density multifamily buildings. Yeah. So I think there's recognition at the city level where this data on excise tax collections and permit issuance is being felt and being seen, but I think it'll take time for that to potentially trickle into Olympia. But Olympia did pass a couple bills that hopefully will make supply a little bit easier, limitations on what cities can require for off-street parking. They've recently passed requirements for clear and objective design review status. The challenge is that the bills that they're passing help supply, generally help design and entitlement risk, and maybe at the margins move some of your construction costs in cities that have required you to over-perk projects, but they're not offsetting the economic and operational risks introduced with the other policies that are moving forward that are detrimental to project returns.
What do you feel about the argument that all these different rules are diminishing the quality of what we're building? Like, it's great to see a new box go up down the street and a bunch of new units, but smaller unit sizes, without parking, without premier amenities. Like, it seems to me to make anything pencil, so cash flow, so you can even get a loan to start the construction, the quality has to suffer. And therefore, are we supplying with a less desirable product as a city?
I've think that's a great question, and I think it's something that hasn't fully been explored. But if you take affordable housing as a microcosm of the issues that the entire industry is facing, there was a wealth of supply that was focused on studios, one-bedroom, small units, and now OH and others are really pushing for 2 and 3 bedroom units, and they want to fund projects that might be 50% 2 and 3 bedrooms. And they're seeing that what they've built does not necessarily fully serve the demand that's out there. I think that's true too on the market rate side, where there's been this concentration and focus on studios and 1s and 2s because you needed that rent per square foot to make your project work. But I think what we're starting to see is that rents on 2 bedrooms are increasing such that, you know, you're still at a lower rent per square foot, but it's getting closer to some of your smaller units. And as long as there's this disconnect and desire for unit type and what's being built, you know, if those rents drive up, then the market will change.
What about, and that's helpful, what about the argument, or what we've experienced, but if you look at all the sale comparables in the last several years, you mentioned OH, which is Office of Housing, they've generally been really small unit buildings where I actually have a specialty, and they've generally paid 30 or 40% above what the market will bear. So for me as a broker, you obviously love pushing the market pricing, but as a resident of Seattle and a taxpayer, I know they're overpaying, and it feels like wasting the tax dollars that I give them on an annual basis. Has that been part of the conversation at all? Why do they pay so much more when they don't need to?
I'm not close enough to the conversation to know if that really has been discussed in depth, but I might guess that they're motivated to get units in the market that are affordable as fast as possible. And so to them it may be less advantageous, or the argument they may be making within that office is that it's less advantageous to get caught up in a bidding war and try to eke out the last dollar, and it's more important to get units online.
Gotcha. Should
they be paying over by 30-40%? They probably could be fine with 10,
yeah.
But I would guess that might be part of why they're less concerned about where market pricing is.
Interesting. So going back to some data, obviously we have a near neighbor, Oregon, that passed this state rent control, was it 6 or 7 years ago, 2019?
Mm-hmm.
What's happening there now? Have they made any improvements? Is it getting more challenging to operate in Oregon? Give us some insight to the next 5 years.
Yeah, Oregon passed a rent control bill that, when it was passed, I think had frankly, from my perspective, as somebody who's been in that market but not super close to it, I don't think it had a huge impact because there was a 15-year exemption for new construction. The rent cap was very high. There was a CPI adjuster. Their effective allowed rent increases were like 15% the first few years. But they were so high that they weren't offering tenants the stability that the lawmakers who pushed for rent control wanted to see in the market. So what Oregon ended up doing is a model more like what we adopted in Washington, where it is 7% plus CPI or 10%, whichever is lower. And that capped the increases allowed in Oregon.
Gotcha.
So
they've gone back and revised it already,
yes.
And it's gotten more restrictive than their initial bill.
Yes.
Okay.
And that's the concern that we have in Washington, is that we start with this, which is where Oregon's ended up, and then it keeps coming down because people don't see the result that they want, and the risk that they don't see the result that they want grows when they're not seeing new supply to help with the supply-demand imbalance. That's what's been driving rent increases over the last several years.
Yeah. I mean, that's where I always default. All of our conversations with clients end with, is it 2 months or 2 years? Do I sell in 2 months or do I wait 2 years? Before the rent controls, if I said you're in a good financial cash position anywhere in the market or in the country, and it has the most parallels to Seattle with the limited amount of land and all the tech and all the growth. So was that discussed at the state level? And if so, what's the counter argument to how do we not turn into the next San Francisco?
The interesting thing was that there was a really big focus on trying to differentiate two different topics that are, in my mind, synonymous: rent control and rent stabilization. So what lawmakers were saying is that rent control is when you cap rents at 3%. It's when you have the more onerous caps like New York has. That's rent control. And we've seen that rent control has a negative effect on housing supply and affordability in New York and San Francisco. And what lawmakers have purported is that what they've proposed is rent stabilization. And so it's different because the cap is high enough that they feel like it absorbs these expenses and allows people to continue to operate and will not have a negative impact on new supply. The data shows that rent control and rent caps can, these artificial distinctions between a 3% and a 7% cap, it can be reasonably assumed and reasonably believed to have the same effects, but the strength of that effect might be stronger if it's 3% cap versus 7% cap.
So like the severity in which it hits the market.
Right. Yeah. So you're going to have a more negative effect on supply if you have 3% cap versus 7% cap, but you're still going to have a negative effect on supply. And I don't think that's something that lawmakers truly understand. I think a lot of people who are not in the weeds on these properties, they're not seeing operational cost increases, as you've outlined, that are much higher than the rent caps. I don't think that they understand that the effect on the market will be the same.
Interesting. So, as a more of a capitalist, we're always talking supply and demand. It's cured rent growth all on its own. Look at how much we built last year or how much we built in the last 5 years, and the 10 years prior to that, rents have grown maybe 2% since the pandemic. And so it's effective. There's too many units, more units than we need right now. We've never seen, that I'm aware of, rent control or rent stabilization work actually provide more affordable housing. It makes it more expensive. Did that come up? What is the argument at a state level, like, it will work this time?
Again, I think it's that belief that what they're doing is not actually rent control. And
Gotcha.
So creating that division where they're saying that this policy will have a different effect, even though that's not what the data says.
You're not saying this, but this sounds delusional to me.
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, I would agree. But, I think that the challenge is that Oregon's policy is still fairly new, and Oregon has had a lot of other factors that have been detrimental to their housing production.
Oh, it's been awful.
Yes, but I think that it's been easy for people to dismiss the data out of Oregon by saying that, well, it's because they had public safety issues, or it's because Portland's inclusionary affordable housing requirements went too far, or it's because of this, it's because of that. So without being able to isolate rent control as a limiting factor in Oregon, it's been hard for us to create a good example to point to of where the same policy that we have in Washington has been detrimental.
Gotcha.
And I think that's made it easier to advance the notion that this is different than a 3% rent control policy. I think also, I think that there was a misconception that some of the supply side ideas that the legislature has done in recent years have been sufficient to offset the detrimental effects of rent control. And certainly there have been good policies like middle housing, which is encouraging greater density, but that is not a middle housing bill is not going to make it easier for somebody to come in and build a 300-unit apartment complex. Yeah. And so the relationship between the incentives that they've passed and the detrimental effects is not balanced, but I think there is an erroneous belief that it may be.
Yeah, interesting. So let's look forward. What was in this bill or proposed at some time, if you believe what I believe, which is it's going to get worse, not better, what other things were proposed that were not included that we may expect in the future? If I'm an owner that's thinking, I don't want to own much longer in Washington, I also don't think it's the best time to sell, what other risks do I have ahead?
I think that there's risks that the cap comes down. Again, having California have a lower cap kind of gives them something to point to, which is always a little dangerous because it shows this policy exists elsewhere. I think this bill started with a number of controls on operational expenses and operational fees and costs. I think those are likely to come back.
What examples do you have of those?
Limits on late fees, security deposit. We've seen in recent years proposals that would limit pet rent, that would limit pet deposits, that would limit charges for valet trash. I think those fees are likely to be the focus of future legislation. And I think that owners of older buildings might also be a little concerned about clean buildings coming up. So this was a bill that passed a number of years ago that requires energy monitoring and eventual compliance for multifamily buildings. And now that owners are starting to look towards the monitoring stage, I think some of the owners of older vintage assets might have some costs to incur that they didn't have to previously before this bill started to move towards the implementation phase.
So more costs to keep up with requirements from, let's say, an environmental perspective, but less ways to generate income?
Yes.
Gotcha. How do we, in essence, because I don't legislate or do anything of that nature, I get the emails from time to time, send this email to this rep, have it say this thing, takes you 2 minutes, I do it. Is that effective? Like, tell me how to be, and all the people out there that are involved, how to be more vocal and get involved. Like, how do we make a difference?
I would say that the most impactful thing that you can do is actually go and meet with your lawmakers, whether you do it during the session or during the off session.
How does one do that?
You can email their office
and say, I want to meet with you.
Yeah, and that may not be super feasible during session, but they might have a town hall event that you could go to, and you might be able to participate in that way. If you're not able to go and physically meet and talk with them, then a call is better than an email.
Okay.
If you're sending an email, it's better to send a personalized email than a form email. All of those things inform the lawmaker as to the relative importance of this issue to their constituents.
And my argument against that would be, I'm just one person with one voice, and I'm going to be painted as someone with self-interest, and therefore not taken seriously, and therefore my vote or voice doesn't count. Do you think differently?
I understand that, and I think that my response would be twofold. One is that they're hearing counter arguments from other people who are just one voice. And so if they don't hear yours, they may never hear an owner or developer's perspective. And so they may only hear that this is a policy I need because my rent increased by 12%, 15% last year. And certainly there are stories of those anecdotes, and it is certainly challenging for those people. But the systematic impact is different than the impact to an individual. And being able to educate on those systematic impacts is something that many regular constituents can't do because they see the impacts that they feel. They don't see the impacts to capital and the impacts to these other pieces. The other thing that I would say is I think that the best thing that we can do as an industry generally is to focus on data. We're not making an impassioned plea. We, I think, as an industry, want our state to be affordable. We want it to be feasible to add new product. We want it to be a place that people want to live. And the more people that want to live here, the better it is for us. So I think that we're not necessarily misaligned in some of the goals that we want, but we are certainly misaligned in the ways that we get there. And the more that you can inform people of what the impacts of their proposed legislation or their prior votes are, maybe the next vote they take is a little bit better aligned with the industry, because if nothing else, they realize that there's twofold impacts of the policy that they're making, and maybe they really want the tenants to have their rents increase at a slower rate than some saw when we had inflation that was going through the roof.
Yeah.
But they may also want new supply, and if you can tell them what meaningful supply bills are, or you can tell them the challenges that you're having with financing capital improvements, and there's an opportunity to add a capital improvements pass through, you may get that support. So, just because somebody doesn't see eye to eye with you across the board on every policy doesn't mean there's not room to educate and help them understand the effects of different policies.
And I would argue, as a little bit of an aside, but I feel like developers, especially in the city of Seattle, have been put through the ringer. And I sat down with an architect last year to really explain, more so to my owners of land, how much their land's been impacted. And it's everything that happened kind of all at once, but you've got the excise tax that you have to factor into the finished product sale, right? And then we did MHA, which is a development cost. And then we added in energy code and other changes to, like, I think the construction code, but street improvements, things that aren't even related to your development that are now being lumped on developers. And so I just don't see why you develop here unless there was some sort of incentive. Do you feel those shops, those developers that are leaving, feel any differently? And how do we, I guess, big question, if I'm a city, right, in Washington did what they did, how do I attract developers to my city?
That's a great question. I think certainly developers are feeling like the requirements that are being placed on projects is just too significant to make these projects work. And it's increased risk the project's bearing, where now you need market rate rents that are so much higher to offset all these costs. Can you fill those units fast enough in order to make this work? Now your entitlement process is longer than it used to be. Can you justify spending money for that much longer before you actually generate any revenue? So those are big questions I think everyone's grappling with. I think if you're a city, there's always this difficult dance if they're trying to fund infrastructure and they want new housing, and it's easy for them to say, okay, new developments, you fund infrastructure. But if the city is able to fund it first as a first mover, if they can get grants that improve their streetscape, that provide the street grid, so you're not having to go dedicate land or what have you, those are opportunities I think that meaningfully change the economics of a deal. If you don't have offsite improvements, if you don't have significant stormwater, if they're able to do a sub-area plan that does your SEPA review, and so your State Environmental Protection Act or Policy Act review is more streamlined, all of those things can provide a benefit. I think there's a lot of levers. And then the multifamily tax exemption, I think, is a great incentive. But
it keeps getting worse.
Yes.
Most people are opting out of whatever version 7 is. I guess it got so bad.
Yeah, and they're relooking at that.
Yeah.
And I think if you're a city, though, and you're saying we want to attract development, the state allows an 8-year exemption with no affordability at all. So if you're a city that says we really need new housing and we're not getting it, put that in place. Do other things that are true incentives rather than ones that, like MFTE, where they're almost trying to balance the incentive and the opportunity cost.
Makes sense. Last question for you. I don't know if I'll call the legislature after this, but I do like to give to causes. If there is one group, you can be biased or unbiased, that you thought had the biggest impact on balancing what the rent control bill that was passed ended up being, what group do you think that was, and me and my clients may want to give to?
I'm very biased to NAIOP Washington State.
Okay.
I'm on their board, led their engagement in the bill. There's also the Washington Multifamily Housing Association and the Rental Housing Association.
So all three, I know those three, they all had played a part?
Yes.
Is there any one that you think is spending the dollars being more effective, or do you think you got to hit on the three totally different inspectors?
As a NAIOP board member, I have to advocate for NAIOP.
Love it.
I think that group has really grown in sophistication, and I think focusing both on research and on advocacy and having lobbyists be boots on the ground, I think it worked really well. And that organization has a lot of owners that are really actively involved and willing to go down to Olympia too. So there was a great movement towards engagement as well that I think was meaningful and was helpful.
That's great to hear. So I want to go a little bit deeper on preemption, and my understanding is if preemption existed in this bill, it would prevent counties and cities from adding their own rent controls. It is not included, but it still exists in a prior bill that banned statewide rent control. Is it completely separate? Is that right?
Yes, so the revised Code of Washington, the RCW, contains a provision that prevents cities and counties from enacting rent control or caps on rental income.
Okay.
And that section of the basically statewide code was not modified by this bill. So that is still in effect.
Okay.
So Seattle cannot implement a different rent cap than what's implemented by the state.
What about like during the pandemic, the emergency rent caps and rules they just somewhat made up? Was that ever contested at a state or city level?
The cities and counties are able to adopt other tenant protections aside from rent control. So things like just cause eviction, caps on late fees, security deposits, notice requirements, they're empowered to do all of that. There is a really interesting, I think it'll be fascinating to watch how this plays out, but there is a lawsuit that Goodman filed, and it was related to an affordable housing building, but I think it's pertinent to all of us.
The Addison?
Yes, where they basically have made the argument in the court that the onerous requirements the city of Seattle has placed on the building have effectively resulted in a takings, even though any one requirement may not have done that.
Yep.
So I think there may be some pushback against these, but as of right now, cities have wide authority to basically adopt, enact, enforce policies that otherwise impact operations as long as it's not rent caps.
Okay, so but they can't impose like a blanket rent control at a city or county
Right.
level. But at a state level, did anyone propose getting rid of that preemption as they were passing this bill to open it up for more cities and counties to get more restrictive? Was that even considered?
Not this year.
Okay.
So it was not part of the conversation at all this year. Last year, there were 3 different rent control bills introduced. One which would have just repealed that state preemption and not adopted a state policy.
So it just pushed it down to the counties and
Yes.
cities? Gotcha.
And that bill really didn't get traction. So
That's-
I think that there's an understanding in Olympia that this should be a consistent policy across the state level.
Okay, feels good.
I think it was 2 years ago now, the city of Seattle considered a trigger ordinance where if the state preemption were to be removed, then the city of Seattle would have an ordinance that would come into effect in that situation, effectively creating a whole policy that the city had agreed on, that the city had ready to go if and when that state preemption were removed.
Like their own rent control is prepared if it was removed?
Yes.
And then now Sawant's gone, so we can all take a big breath of fresh
Yes.
air?
Yeah, that
Is what I'm reading?
Yes, that ordinance
was her,
did not
her,
pass.
her final
and-
cry?
Yeah, yeah. It was very stressful though as an industry because
Yeah.
many cities look to Seattle, and so you're like, if Seattle passes this, are we going to have a patchwork of policies proposed in all these other different cities,
Yeah.
and then be super vigilant, need to be incredibly vigilant about what happens at the state level. But luckily, that trigger ordinance did not pass in the city of Seattle, and state preemption against rent control remains in effect.
Okay. Well, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.